Look around you and ask a simple question that the powerful hope you never ask. If the world is richer than it has ever been, why are the producers of that wealth poorer, more exhausted, and more disposable than ever before? Why does abundance coexist with deprivation? Why does progress arrive chained to misery? And why does the worker, whose hands build everything, own almost nothing of what they create? This contradiction is not an accident. It is the beating heart of the system under which you live. Society presents itself as a natural order, as though the hierarchy of wealth and power were as inevitable as gravity. You are told that success is earned individually, that poverty is a personal failure, that exploitation is merely competition by another name. But history, when stripped of its comforting lies, tells a different story. The history of all societies is the history of class struggle. Oppressor and oppressed stand in constant opposition, locked in a conflict over who controls labor, who commands resources, and who decides how human life is spent. Under capitalism, labor is transformed into a commodity. Your time, your energy, your creativity, even your exhaustion are bought and sold on a market that you do not control. You enter this market not as a free equal, but as someone compelled to sell their labor in order to survive. The capitalist does not enrich society through genius or virtue. Wealth flows to them because they own the means of production. They own the factories, the offices, the platforms, the land, while you own only your capacity to work. This imbalance is the foundation of domination. Every day you produce more value than you receive in wages. This unpaid labor, this surplus value, is seized and accumulated by those who do not labor as you do. It becomes profit, capital, and power. It expands itself relentlessly, demanding longer hours, lower wages, greater insecurity. The system does not exploit because it is cruel. It exploits because exploitation is its logic. Capital must grow or die, and it grows by consuming human life. And what does this system give you in return for your sacrifice? Precarity disguised as flexibility, debt masquerading as opportunity, competition that turns worker against worker, neighbor against neighbor, until solidarity is replaced by fear. You are told to be grateful for employment that drains your body and fractures your spirit. You are told that survival itself is a privilege. In this way, domination is made to feel normal, even deserved. The ruling class does not rely on force alone. It rules through ideas, through institutions that teach obedience instead of understanding, through media that glorifies wealth while criminalizing poverty, through laws that protect property over people, profit over life. The state presents itself as neutral, but it stands as the executive committee of the ruling class, enforcing the conditions necessary for exploitation to continue. Ideology becomes a weapon, persuading the oppressed to defend the very system that oppresses them. Yet within the system lies the seed of its own undoing. Capitalism organizes workers collectively in production, while isolating them socially and politically. It creates immense productive power, but concentrates control in fewer hands. It sharpens inequality until it becomes impossible to ignore. In doing so, it produces not only wealth, but consciousness. The worker begins to see that their suffering is not individual, but shared, that their enemy is not another worker, but the structure that exploits them all. Class consciousness is not a gift bestowed from above. It emerges from struggle. It arises when workers recognize themselves as a class with common interests opposed to those of capital. When they understand that unity is not a moral ideal, but a material necessity, alone, the worker is replaceable. Together, workers are unstoppable. Every gain in history, every reduction in working hours, every safety, protection, every right was won not through generosity, but through organized resistance. Do not be deceived by reforms that leave the foundation intact. A system built on exploitation cannot be humanized without being transformed. As long as the means of production remain in private hands, as long as profit governs social life, inequality will reproduce itself in new forms. True liberation requires a revolutionary transformation of social relations. It requires that production be organized for human need, not private accumulation. That labor be freed from alienation and life from commodification. This is not a call to chaos, but to reason, not to blind rage, but to conscious action. The working class has nothing to lose but the chains that bind it, and a world to win. History does not move forward by the will of the powerful alone. It moves through the collective action of those who refuse to remain silent, who recognize their strength, and who dare to imagine a society beyond exploitation. Your labor creates wealth. Let it no longer pay for your misery. Let it become the foundation of a world where human dignity is not a privilege but a condition of existence. Organize, educate, unite. The future will not be granted to you. It must be taken consciously, collectively, and without apology. Labor is the source of all wealth in society. Yet the worker who produces this wealth is systematically denied its full value, receiving only a wage that barely sustains existence while the surplus is seized by those who own the means of production. Every commodity, every building, every machine, every service carries within it the crystallized labor of human beings. But this labor is rendered invisible the moment it is transformed into profit. Capital presents itself as productive, as though wealth flows naturally from money, technology, or management. But capital is nothing without labor, and its power lies precisely in concealing this dependence. The worker enters production with living labor, while the capitalist contributes ownership and control. Yet it is labor that animates raw materials, gives value to machines, and turns potential into reality. Under capitalism, wages are not a fair exchange for labor, but the price of survival. The worker is paid not according to the value they create, but according to what is necessary to reproduce their capacity to work. Food, shelter, rest, and minimal comfort define the wage, not the immense wealth generated during the working day. The difference between what workers produce and what they are paid becomes surplus value, appropriated by the capitalist as profit. This extraction is not an exception or a moral failing of individual employers. It is the fundamental mechanism by which the system operates. Without surplus value, capital cannot accumulate, expand, or dominate, and thus exploitation becomes a structural requirement rather than a choice. The longer the working day, the greater the surplus extracted. The more efficient the worker becomes through discipline, technology, and intensified labor, the more value is produced without a corresponding rise in wages. Productivity increases do not liberate workers, they deepen exploitation by allowing more value to be extracted in less time. Machines, rather than freeing labor from toil, are used to displace workers, depress wages, and enforce obedience through the constant threat of unemployment. Labor becomes fragmented, standardized, and dehumanized, reduced to repetitive motions that drain both body and mind, while enriching those who never touch the tools of production. This relationship transforms the worker into an alien being within their own labor. What they produce does not belong to them, nor does it serve their needs directly. The product confronts the worker as something foreign, owned and controlled by another, even though it exists only because of their effort. Work, which should be an expression of human creativity and collective purpose, becomes a burden endured for survival. The worker, as life is divided into hours sold to capital and moments of recovery required, to return to work, leaving little space for genuine freedom, development, or fulfillment. The capitalist claims risk and entrepreneurship as justification for profit, but risk is borne daily by workers whose livelihoods depend on forces beyond their control. Market fluctuations, layoffs, crises, and automation threaten the worker's existence. While capital protects itself through diversification, insurance, and state support. When profits soar, workers are told to be patient. When crises strike, workers are told to sacrifice. The system socializes losses and privatizes gains, ensuring that labor absorbs instability while capital secures continuity. This extraction of surplus value does not remain confined to the workplace. It shapes the entire structure of society. Wealth accumulates at one pole, poverty at the other, creating classes with fundamentally opposed interests. Those who live from labor struggle to survive, while those who live from ownership command political influence, cultural authority, and social prestige. The inequality that emerges is then justified as natural or deserved, obscuring the reality that it is produced through exploitation embedded in everyday economic relations. Ideology plays a crucial role in maintaining this arrangement. Workers are taught to see wages as fair compensation, competition as freedom, and exploitation as opportunity. Individual success stories are elevated to mask collective deprivation, while failure is personalized and detached from structural conditions. The worker is encouraged to identify with capital as goals, to internalize productivity demands, and to measure worth through output, even as the rewards of that output are systematically denied. Despite this, the contradiction remains unresolved. Labor creates all wealth, yet receives only a fraction. Contradiction that intensifies as productivity rises and inequality deepens. As workers recognize that their shared condition is not the result of personal inadequacy, but of a system designed to extract value from their collective effort, the illusion of fairness begins to crack. The realization that capital depends entirely on labor, while labor is rendered powerless through division and dispossession, reveals a latent force within the working class that exists, not as an abstract idea, but as a material reality waiting to be understood, organized, and acted upon in the factories, offices, fields, and streets where wealth is produced. Everyday capitalism survives not because it serves humanity, but because it perfects exploitation, institutionalizes surplus value, and concentrates control of the means of production in the hands of a minority whose power depends on the continued subordination of the majority. At its core, capitalism is not a system of free exchange, but a system of organized domination in which one class owns the conditions of production while another is forced to sell its labor in order to live. This separation between workers and the means by which they produce is the foundation upon which all capital power rests, transforming human activity into a source of profit rather than collective well-being. Exploitation under capitalism does not appear as overt coercion, but as an everyday economic necessity. The worker is formally free to sell their labor to any employer, yet materially unfree, because survival depends on finding someone willing to buy that labor. This apparent freedom masks a deeper compulsion. Once inside the labor process, the worker produces value far beyond what is returned in wages. The working day is divided into necessary labor, which reproduces the worker, wage and surplus labor, which creates value appropriated by the capitalist. This surplus value is the lifeblood of capitalism, the source of profit, accumulation, and expansion, extracted silently and routinely from collective labor. Surplus value is not generated by clever management or financial maneuvering, but by unpaid labor time. Capital disguises this reality by presenting profit as the reward for investment or innovation. Yet investment itself is nothing more than accumulated surplus from past exploitation. The capitalist advances wages and materials, but these are reclaimed many times over through the labor process. As productivity increases, the share of surplus grows, while wages are held down through competition, unemployment, and the constant threat of replacement. The system rewards those who extract more surplus and punishes those who fail to do so, ensuring that exploitation becomes a competitive necessity rather than a moral choice. Control of the means of production ensures that this process remains firmly in the hands of the ruling class. Factories, machines, land, infrastructure, and increasingly digital platforms are owned privately, allowing capital to dictate not only how goods are produced, but how work itself is organized. Workers are excluded from decision-making, reduced to executing tasks designed to maximize output and minimize costs. This control extends beyond the workplace into society as a whole, shaping education to produce obedient workers, shaping culture to glorify productivity, and shaping politics to protect property relations. Technological development under capitalism does not aim to reduce human suffering, but to increase efficiency in extracting surplus value. Machines are introduced not to free workers from labor, but to intensify labor, extend control, and discipline the workforce. Automation becomes a weapon against labor, creating a reserve army of the unemployed that suppresses wages and weakens resistance. Even when technology increases overall wealth, the benefits flow upward. While workers face insecurity, de-skilling, and intensified surveillance, progress becomes another tool of domination, reinforcing the power of capital over labor. The state functions as a guarantor of these relations. Laws protecting private property, enforcing contracts, and suppressing collective resistance ensure that the extraction of surplus value proceeds without interruption. When crises erupt, the state intervenes to stabilize capital, socializing losses while preserving ownership. Workers are told that austerity is unavoidable, that sacrifice is necessary, while vast resources are mobilized to rescue banks and corporations. Political power follows economic power, and democracy is constrained by the limits imposed by capital accumulation. Ideology plays a crucial role in sustaining this system. Capitalism presents exploitation as opportunity, inequality as merit, and control as efficiency. Workers are encouraged to identify with the goals of capital, to see productivity as virtue, and to blame themselves for structural failures. Individual advancement is emphasized to obscure collective exploitation, while competition fractures solidarity and isolates resistance. The very language of economics strips labor of its human character, reducing life itself to inputs, outputs, and costs. Yet capitalism's survival depends on deepening contradiction. The more surplus value it extracts, the more it concentrates wealth and power, undermining the conditions of social stability. The more it expands production, the more it reveals the irrationality of abundance existing alongside deprivation. The system depends on labor while systematically degrading it, depends on social cooperation while enforcing private control, depends on human creativity while reducing human beings to expendable resources. These contradictions are not external threats, but internal limits produced by the logic of capital itself, unfolding wherever workers recognize that. Exploitation is not a temporary flaw, but the condition upon which the entire system stands and continues to stand only as long as control over the means of production remains beyond the reach of those whose labor makes society possible. The ruling class maintains power not merely through wealth, but through a complex structure of ideology, state institutions, and deliberate division among workers that ensures domination appears natural, inevitable, and even desirable. Economic control alone would be unstable without a corresponding control over ideas, narratives, and social organization. Power is preserved by shaping how people think about the world, how they interpret their suffering, and how they understand their place within society. The greatest achievement of the ruling class is not the accumulation of capital, but the ability to convince the oppressed that the existing order is either just or unchangeable. Ideology functions as the invisible framework through which exploitation is normalized. From an early age, Individuals are taught to see society as a collection of isolated individuals, competing for success rather than as classes bound by shared material conditions. Wealth is presented as a reward for talent and effort, while poverty is framed as a personal failure or lack of discipline. This narrative obscures the structural nature of inequality and redirects frustration inward, preventing workers from recognizing exploitation as a collective experience. By defining freedom as consumer choice and success as individual advancement, ideology transforms systemic domination into a matter of personal responsibility. Education systems reinforce this worldview by prioritizing obedience, productivity, and conformity over critical analysis of social relations. Workers are trained to adapt to the demands of the market rather than question its legitimacy. History is stripped of its conflicts and revolutions, reduced to a sequence of neutral events rather than struggles between classes. Economics is taught as an abstract science divorced from power and exploitation, presenting capitalist relations as timeless laws rather than historically produced arrangements. Through this process, ideology becomes internalized, reproduced by workers themselves, even when it contradicts their lived reality. The state acts as the institutional guardian of this order, while presenting itself as a neutral arbiter representing the common good. It is structured to protect private property and the conditions necessary for capital accumulation. Laws governing labor, contracts, and ownership overwhelmingly favor those who control resources over those who sell their labor. When workers organize to challenge exploitation, the state intervenes through legal restrictions, surveillance, policing, and, when necessary, force. Strikes are regulated, protests are contained, and dissent is criminalized, all while maintaining the appearance of legality and order. Political participation under capitalism is carefully limited. Elections offer choices between factions that differ in rhetoric but agree on preserving the fundamental structure of ownership and profit. Policy debates revolve around managing capitalism more efficiently rather than questioning its legitimacy. Even reforms won through struggle are designed to stabilize the system, alleviating pressure without altering the underlying relations of power. In moments of crisis, the state reveals its true function by mobilizing resources to rescue corporations and financial institutions while imposing austerity on workers, demonstrating where its loyalties ultimately lie. Division among workers is one of the most effective tools of domination. Capitalism fragments the working class along lines of nationality, race, gender, religion, and employment status, transforming potential allies into perceived competitors. Migrant workers are blamed for unemployment, marginalized communities are scapegoated for social decay, and precarious workers are pitted against those with relative security. These divisions are not accidental. They are cultivated through media, political discourse, and workplace structures that reward competition over solidarity. As long as workers are fighting each other, they are not fighting the system that exploits them all. The labor market itself enforces division by ranking workers according to skill, status, wage, creating hierarchies within the working class that mirror the larger class structure. Fear of downward mobility encourages conformity and discourages resistance. The threat of unemployment disciplines those still employed, while the unemployed are stigmatized and isolated. This constant pressure prevents collective organization and sustains the illusion that survival depends on individual performance rather than collective power. Media plays a central role in reinforcing ideology and division. Corporate-controlled platforms shape public discourse, prioritizing narratives that protect existing power relations. Stories of wealth and success are celebrated, while systemic critiques are marginalized or portrayed as unrealistic and dangerous. Conflict is personalized, sensationalized, and detached from material conditions, ensuring that anger is misdirected towards symbols and individuals rather than structures. By controlling what is visible and what is silenced, the ruling class limits the horizons of political imagination. Yet, this system of control is never complete. Ideology must be constantly reinforced, because material reality continually contradicts it. Workers experience exploitation, insecurity, and dispossession daily, creating cracks in the dominant narrative. The very need to divide workers reveals the latent power of unity that the ruling class fears. When workers begin to see through ideological illusions, recognize the role of the state in protecting capital, and understand that their divisions serve interests opposed to their own, the foundations of ruling class power begin to weaken, not through spontaneous outrage, but through the slow and dangerous emergence of shared awareness rooted in lived experience and collective struggle that challenges the legitimacy of domination at its core. Class consciousness is the process through which workers move from experiencing exploitation as isolated individuals to understanding it as a shared condition rooted in the structure of society. Under capitalism, workers are deliberately fragmented, separated by workplaces, contracts, identities, and competition, encouraged to view one another as rivals rather than allies. This isolation conceals the collective nature of their labor and weakens their ability to recognize the source of their oppression. Class consciousness emerges when workers begin to see beyond these divisions and recognize themselves as part of a class whose interests are fundamentally opposed to those who own and control the means of production. In the absence of class consciousness, exploitation appears personal and accidental. A worker blames themselves for low wages, insecurity, or exhaustion, believing that better effort, better skills, or better choices will lead to stability. This belief traps workers within the logic of the system, directing frustration inward rather than toward the social relations that produce inequality. Class consciousness breaks this illusion by revealing that exploitation is not the result of individual failure, but a structural necessity of capitalism. When workers recognize that their struggles are shared across industries, regions, and identities, suffering is transformed from private shame into collective understanding. This transformation does not arise from abstract theory alone, but from lived experience within the labor process. Workers encounter the same pressures: intensified productivity, declining jobs, security, and rising costs of living, regardless of personal differences. These common conditions create the material basis for shared awareness. Through discussion, organization, and struggle, workers begin to connect their experiences to broader social patterns. What once seemed like isolated problems are understood as expressions of a system that prioritizes profit over human life. Class consciousness also exposes the false neutrality of institutions that claim to represent everyone equally. Workers come to see how laws, political systems, and cultural narratives consistently favor those with economic power. The state, which presents itself as an impartial guardian of order, is revealed as an instrument that protects property relations and suppresses challenges to them. Media narratives that celebrate wealth and stigmatize poverty are recognized as tools that legitimize inequality. This awareness strips away the moral authority of the ruling class and undermines the ideological foundations of domination. As consciousness deepens, workers begin to understand their collective power. Capital depends entirely on labor to function, yet labor is rendered powerless through division and disorganization. Class consciousness reveals that this dependence can be reversed. When workers act together, they disrupt the flow of surplus value upon which capital relies. Collective action transforms labor from a passive input into an active force capable of reshaping social relations. Solidarity becomes not an abstract ideal, but a practical necessity rooted in shared material interests. This unity does not erase differences among workers, but reframes them within a broader struggle. Class consciousness recognizes that divisions of race, gender, nationality, and employment status are real and deeply experienced. Yet it also reveals how these divisions are exploited to weaken collective resistance. Rather than denying difference, class consciousness situates it within a common fight against exploitation. It creates the possibility for alliances that do not rely on sameness, but on shared opposition to a system that benefits from fragmentation. Through organization, workers begin to develop alternative forms of power and knowledge. Unions, councils, and collective movements become spaces where experience are shared, strategies are debated, and confidence is built. These forms of organization challenge the isolation imposed by capitalism, production, and create a counterweight to the centralized power of capital. Workers learn not only to resist exploitation, but to envision different ways of organizing production and social life based on cooperation rather than domination. Class consciousness is inherently dynamic. It grows through struggle, setbacks, and contradiction. Victories strengthen awareness, while defeats expose the limits of partial reforms and isolated actions. Each confrontation with capital reveals new dimensions of power and resistance, deepening understanding and sharpening resolve. This process transforms workers from passive subjects shaped by economic forces into active agents capable of shaping history. When workers recognize themselves as a class, they cease to see exploitation as a permanent condition and begin to see it as a relationship that can be challenged and transformed. The realization that their collective labor sustains society, while their collective action can disrupt and reorganize it, marks a decisive shift in political possibility. Class consciousness turns the scattered experiences of exploitation into a shared narrative of struggle, binding individual lives to a common historical trajectory in which the working class appears not as a mass of victims, but as a force capable of confronting capital, redefining social relations, and asserting control over the conditions of its own existence within a system that depends on its labor yet fears its unity. Collective organization is not a moral preference or an abstract ideal, but a material necessity, arising from the conditions of exploitation under capitalism. Isolated workers possess little power against a system that controls production, resources, and political institutions. Individually, workers can be replaced, disciplined, or discarded, but collectively they represent the force upon which the entire system depends. Capitalism fragments labor precisely because unity threatens its foundation. Collective organization emerges as the means through which workers overcome isolation, transform shared suffering into shared strength, and confront exploitation as a structural reality rather than a personal burden. Exploitation persists because it is embedded in the organization of production itself. As long as the means of production remain privately owned, labor exists primarily as a source of surplus value rather than as an expression of human potential. Wages may fluctuate, conditions may improve temporarily, but the fundamental relationship remains unchanged. The worker produces wealth they do not control, while decisions about production are made according to profit rather than human need. Collective organization challenges this arrangement by asserting workers' interests as collective interests, refusing the logic that pits one worker against another in competition for survival. Through organization, workers gain the capacity to act as a class rather than as dispersed individuals. Unions, councils, and mass movements provide structures through which grievances are articulated, strategies are developed, and power is exercised. These forms of organization disrupt the normal functioning of exploitation by interfering with production, circulation, and profit. They force capital to confront labor not as a cost to be minimized, but as a social force capable of resistance. Organization transforms vulnerability into leverage, making visible the dependence of capital on collective labor. However, collective organization alone is insufficient if it remains confined within the boundaries set by the existing system. Reforms that improve conditions without challenging ownership and control can ease immediate suffering, but they cannot abolish exploitation. Capital adapts, recovers, and reasserts dominance, often reclaiming concessions through crises, restructuring, or repression. Systemic transformation becomes necessary because exploitation is not a malfunction of capitalism, but its defining feature. To end exploitation, the social relations that produce it must be transformed. Systemic transformation requires reimagining how production is organized and for whom it exists. Instead of production driven by private profit, it must be oriented toward collective need. This implies social ownership of the means of production and democratic control over economic decisions. Workers must cease to be mere instruments of accumulation and become conscious participants in shaping social life. Such a transformation does not emerge spontaneously, nor is it granted by existing power structures. It is the result of sustained struggle, organization, and the development of class consciousness. Human dignity cannot be reclaimed within a system that treats labor as a commodity and life as an input cost. Dignity requires more than survival. It requires autonomy, creativity, and meaningful participation in collective life. Under capitalism, work is often alienating, repetitive, and devoid of purpose beyond profit. Systemic transformation aims to abolish this alienation by reconnecting labor with social purpose and human development. When workers control production, work can become a cooperative activity directed toward shared goals rather than an imposed necessity endured for wages. Collective organization also plays a crucial role in breaking the ideological grip of capitalism. Through shared struggle, workers learn that their experiences are not isolated, that their suffering is not deserved, and that alternatives are possible. Organization creates spaces where dominant narratives are questioned and new forms of understanding emerge. It cultivates solidarity across divisions, deliberately fostered to weaken resistance. In this process, workers not only fight exploitation, but also transform themselves, developing confidence, political awareness, and a sense of collective agency. The ruling class resists systemic transformation because it threatens the basis of its power. It deploys repression, co-optation, and ideological attacks to weaken movements that challenge existing relations. Failures and setbacks are inevitable, but they also expose the limit of partial solutions and reinforce the necessity of deeper change. Each struggle contributes to a broader historical process in which the working class learn through action the scale of transformation required to secure lasting liberation. Collective organization and systemic transformation are inseparable because one provides the means while the other defines the goal. Organization without transformation risks containment, while transformation without organization remains abstract. Together, they represent the only path through which exploitation can be abolished, and human dignity reclaimed, not as a gift bestowed from above, but as a condition produced through conscious, collective effort rooted in the material realities of labor, struggle, and the ongoing effort to reshape society in the interests of those who create its wealth, yet have been denied control over its direction. The truth revealed through this struggle is simple and unforgiving, a society that lives from labor while denying. Labor dignity cannot endure without constant repression and delusion. Capitalism survives only by exhausting human life, fragmenting solidarity, and disguising exploitation as inevitability. Yet every factory, every office, every field, every street where workers gather stands as proof that the system rests not on the strength of the ruling class, but on the collective labor of those it exploits. The power that dominates society is borrowed power drawn daily from the hands and minds of workers who have been taught to forget their own strength. History does not move forward through moral appeals to those who profit from injustice. It advances when the oppressed recognize themselves as a force capable of reshaping the world. Class consciousness transforms suffering into understanding, understanding into organization, and organization into material power. When workers unite across divisions imposed to weaken them, they expose the lie that exploitation is natural and reveal it as a social relation that can be abolished. The struggle is not for charity or inclusion within an unjust system, but for the transformation of the system itself. A society organized around human need rather than profit is not a utopian dream, but a rational necessity produced by the contradictions of capitalism. The same labor that sustains exploitation can dismantle it. The same collective power that enriches a few can be reclaimed to liberate all. The future will belong not to those who own, but to those who produce, not to those who command, but to those who labor together with conscious purpose. Workers of the world are bound not by weakness, but by shared conditions and shared potential. In unity lies the end of exploitation. In organization lies the path to dignity. In collective struggle lies the power to reclaim life from profit and to build a society worthy of the human beings who create it.